Uh, Thank you, recording in progress. Got it. Reverend Antonio also serves as trustee of the RCS Community Library in Ravena, and is also the president of the Upper Hudson Library System Board, which is the last time I saw him, by the way. By the way, among other things, the Upper Hudson Library System provides the transport of books between all of the system's libraries when we ask to borrow a book here in Albany from the RSC Community Library collection, for instance. Reverend Booth reviewed Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir of a family and culture in crisis by J.D. Vance, well before the COVID, back in 2017. We are lucky to have him back for another review to discuss the book Driving While Black, African American Travel and the Road to Civil Rights by Gretchen Sorin. There's also a documentary movie covering the same subject called Driving While Black, Race, Space, and Mobility in America, written and directed by Gretchen Sorin and Rick Burns. And before we turn this over to Reverend Booth, our director, Scott, would like to have a couple words.
I just wanted to note, I just wanted to say publicly, it's great to have Dr. Booth here, but, you know, under his leadership, the wonderful staff at Upper Hudson Library System have done an anti-racism task force, and Albany Public Library staff have been involved. And it's just fantastic to see. We've been doing a lot of work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and libraries have a lot of work to do in regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I just, you know, I'm a big fan of when someone walks the walk, I like to note that they're not just talking the talk, but they're also walking the walk. And I just really want to give kudos and an introduction and a welcome back to Reverend Booth, because the work that that circle's been doing, that my peers have been doing, and that the staff have been doing has been fantastic. And I think it should be noted publicly. So I can't be here for the entire presentation because well, we all know my schedule, but I wanted to make a little bit of time out to just say thank you for your leadership and thank you for the work that you're doing. And I'm looking forward to the impact that it's going to have on libraries in the Upper Hudson Library System, I believe, for a very, very long time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to thank you all for inviting me to be here. This is about my third time discussing this book, Driving While Black. One of the things I like to say about racism and addressing the issue of racism is that you have to see it not as a sprint, but as a triathlon. And so a lot of times with a lot of white Americans, when they look at racism, they want to know, and they start discussing the issues and trying to figure out solutions. They want them to be relatively fast because we're in a fast-paced world. However, we've been dealing with this issue of racism, African Americans in particular, for about 400 years, since the founding of this country. So, and we know that it's not a sprint, but it's a triathlon. And that's what we have to look at it as when we're dealing with this. So I'm very happy that the Upper Hudson Library System is involved with addressing the issue of racism and trying to get member libraries to be involved with issues of equity and justice. So I want to thank the Albany Public Library for doing that, taking the initiative to be engaged in that activity. Now, this book, Driving While Black, is an interesting book. And if you are an African American in particular, a person of my age, where my mother and father grew up were born in the 20s, and they grew up in the 30s and 40s. My mother graduated in 1945 from Farmville Colored High School in Farmville, North Carolina. And both my parents endured all the degradation of Jim Crow laws and segregation. So when you read this book as an African American, it resonates with me. I've done this, I've met with Gretchen, Dr. Sorin at least twice. I've done 2 interviews with her twice, once just with her, the second with Dr. Sorin and also Rick Burns, the film producer, and now I'm doing it here. And people have noted that whenever we have the interview, it sounds like a conversation. And it sounds like a conversation because it's something that I've had to go through in my own personal life. I've had to live out some of the things that she's talked about in this book. Not everything, but some of the things she's talked about. And even my mother and father and grandparents also had to, and great-grandparents had to endure some of those things too. So this book, Driving While Black, is an interesting book because number one, Sorin takes this inanimate object and makes it alive to us and shows us how it changed the lifestyle of African Americans for the better and also for the worse eventually, but for the better mostly. And so she's dealing with this whole issue of space and mobility. And a lot of times we take space and mobility for granted. We like our own personal space, and we don't like people to invade it. And so she starts off helping us to understand that African American space has always been invaded, and their mobility has always been short-circuited or even restricted. So when she starts off the book, she starts talking about the restrictions of movement by African Americans. She's setting up this scenario so we can understand exactly why the car was so essential in the life of African Americans. She starts off talking about slavery. And in slavery, they had these patrols or patrollers or patty rollers. And they were given authority to go on plantations to make sure that other slaves weren't visiting those plantations to see family members or even their spouses or children. And that these patrols also had responsibility of checking to make sure that when a person had a pass, a slave had a pass to go into another community, that person had a pass and could go into that community, and the person had to return by a certain time, or if not, they didn't return by a certain time. They gave the patrols authority to beat that slave for being late or not or violating the pass. So this whole, so even then she lets us know about this whole restriction of movement for the African slave. And so after slavery, she begins to talk about the Black codes or the Jim Crow laws that came into existence. And these laws, again, dealt with restriction of movement, restriction of space. Many of these laws dealt with segregated buses, whereas you would pay to get on a public bus, like in the city of Albany, you would pay to get on a bus at the front, and you have to walk to the back door to get on the bus. Or if there was, and then you have to sit in a restricted section, and then even that restricted section could be invaded if there were not enough seats for people, for white people, and therefore you would have to end up standing. So, and then even trains were segregated, where African Americans were placed in segregated sections, cars on a train, and and they were they were subpar quality. The seats were threadbare or dirty. The toilets were always rarely cleaned and dirty. And sometimes they would place the African American in the front of the train, and so all the soot from the engine of the train would enter into that particular car. So she deals with this whole issue of being restricted in mobility, being restricted in even space. And so she's setting up a scenario so we can understand it. I'm going to just read a section about these buses that people don't understand how badly things were going on with buses and trains in particular. So if you go to like page 26, it states on page 26, read just a section. An attorney who was the first Episcopal priest, female priest, Black priest, her name was Polly Mary, from Durham, North Carolina, my hometown. She was a young attorney in the civil rights movement, and she decided to board a bus to Durham, North Carolina, to visit relatives for the Easter holiday with her friend. And she said that Mary despised bus travel because of the public humiliation of Black people to be carried out in the presence of privileged white spectators who witnessed our shame in silence or indifference. She said, when the two women changed buses in Richmond, they found that the Greyhound seats were broken. So they sat in one of the rows reserved for white passengers. The bus driver insisted that they move to the broken seats, and he called the police when they refused. They were charged with disorderly conduct and fined $45. They were ordered to jail by the judge when they could not afford to pay. In 1946, Irene Morgan, a woman in her late 20s, traveling through Virginia from her home in Baltimore, refused to give up her seat when the bus driver demanded that she relinquish it to a white passenger. Morgan informed the driver that because the bus was on an interstate trip, she was not required to observe interstate segregation laws. After an unpleasant verbal exchange, the bus driver refused to continue the trip and called the sheriff. With all the other passengers watching, the sheriff and a deputy dragged Morgan from the bus and arrested her. She was jailed for violating Virginia's transit segregation law and also charged with resisting arrest for kicking and fighting back as the law officers physically removed her from the train. There were incidents like this, one after another, that Gretchen Sorin records in her book to give us a picture of the amount of degradation and amount of disrespect that many African Americans received while trying to just go from one place to another to visit relatives by bus or train. She also notes that Trailways and Greyhound, that were the major bus lines at the time, were complicit in this behavior also. They didn't fight against interstate these interstate segregation laws. They passively ignored them, built segregated facilities, which cost them up to 50%, which added up to 50% of their construction costs, because they didn't want to make waves with the present time. Now, on the trains, I want to read you an incident of this woman named Vernell Allen. In 1946, she and a friend decided that they went on a visit somewhere on a vacation. They came back, they got on a train in Norfolk, Virginia, and they went to the dining car, she was hungry, and she told the steward, I want bacon and eggs and ham. And that's what she told the steward. The waiter looked at her very quietly, this Black waiter, and he said to her very quietly, so no one could overhear a conversation, "You don't want that." The waiter whispered, "I'll bring you some orange juice and some coffee. Everything else," he whispered, "if I serve it to you, it's food that's been scraped off white people's plates from the other room." And so they understand that the women would be upset by this revelation. He sent them back to the seats hungry. The waiter sweetened the message that accompanied this small act of defiance with kindness. He said, "To make the day better for you, I'm going to put some vodka in your orange juice." And that's just one of many incidents that Gretchen Sorin records relating to this issue of restriction and space. And so the automobile begins to change the dynamics of African Americans having to accept this humiliation on public travel. I mean, even on some buses, I wanted to say, even on some public buses, if a bus driver got angry at an African American, that bus driver could shoot that person. And sometimes the white travelers would also join in and kick the person, shoot the person too. So there was a lot of humiliation, but the automobile changed the game. And so in 1925, if you look at the film based on this book, you'll discover that used cars in 1925 could cost as little as $100 to purchase. A new car cost about $300, but a used car around 1925 could cost about $100, which meant that it made cars more accessible to everyday people. They could save their pennies and dimes and they could end up with a car. And so what happened was more and more African Americans began to purchase cars, and these cars were not a status symbol, but they were a method to gain freedom of movement and not have to deal with the degradation of segregation and Jim Crow laws. W.E.B. Du Bois, he drove a car. He's a noted African-American sociologist who wrote The Souls of Black People. He loved driving. And she has a picture of him driving in one of his cars. But he also stated he also lets people know how much it affected people in such a way. He stated that he remembers Bishop Turner, who was very sick with paralysis and could not hire a Pullman from Savannah to Atlanta, and he had to sit in the Jim Crow smoker across 2 seats. But then he said yesterday when he was driving, he saw that the AME Bishop of Florida was gliding along his Cadillac with a chauffeur on the way from Jacksonville to Atlanta, and he said he looked extremely comfortable. Du Bois noted in 1932, when he drove all the way from New York to Harlan County, Kentucky, to observe a contentious coal miners' strike, he saw everywhere colored people traveling in their old automobiles. He noticed an increasing number of Black car owners, and that car ownership was not particularly a boon to businessmen, insurance agents, office of fraternal and religious societies, and the like. That's what he noticed, that there was this increase of people driving. And the reason there was an increase in people driving, because I'm going to quote from this wealthy African-American from Durham, North Carolina, again, it's in the book, my hometown. So, I got to quote something from Durham. And he states this. He says, this wealthy African-American Black man from North Carolina said, he said, of course, Negroes ride in the Jim Crow coach here, but I don't ride in it. I just don't ride trains now. I use my car and I drive anywhere I want to go. That's one of the reasons I have a car. Operating a motor car proved to be a wonderful, liberating experience for citizens for whom the full rights of citizenship and mobility was denied. So the automobile opened up the entire nation for exploration and an emboldened African-American people to visit national parks and monuments and historic museums and to take vacations or just to go for a drive. And so she builds this case to show why African-Americans began to embrace cars. And not only does she tell us why they embrace cars, but she talks about the types of cars they like to drive. And a lot of times they drove large cars. They like to drive cars such as Buicks. She has some statistics about the types of cars that African-Americans drove. Let me find it first, and then I'll tell you where it is. But they like Buicks, they liked Fords, they liked Chevrolets. Those were the top 3 cars that they drove. And so they liked them because they were heavy duty cars. On page 59, she talks about how, about African-American car ownership. And usually the top 3 were Buicks, Fords, Chevrolet. Plymouth was the 4th. Cadillac was the last, but people like Cadillac, but that was the more expensive car. And so what she says is they got these cars, and they seem like expensive cars because they were considered large, number one. They wanted large cars. They wanted reliable cars. That's the number one reason. They wanted cars that were reliable, because if it was a reliable car, they didn't have to worry about it breaking down in places that could be hostile toward them. And that's why they got these large cars that were reliable, such as a Buick. And that was like the number one choice, was a Buick, because it was large and it was reliable. But the other reason they liked it large and reliable, because they liked it because it was also heavy. So if they came into a hostile crowd that was trying to harm them, it would be very difficult for that crowd to roll over that particular car. They wanted a car also that could pick up speed rather fast, because if they got into a hostile situation, they could outrun those folks that might be trying to harm them. So there was some logic to buying these large, heavy-duty cars, because it was out of necessity. it was out of this issue of not making sure that they could travel safely without harm. The other reason they wanted it large, because they wanted to have a large trunk, because they wanted to be able to store items in it, such as food, because they couldn't stop on the way to various places that could give them food. You heard my explanation that I read about this woman named Vernell, who stated the food she got off the train would be food that would be that white people didn't want and be scraped off their plates. So therefore, they brought their own food, their own chicken and potato salad or whatever they bought with them, with iced tea, and then it had water in case there was an issue with their car that they needed. They brought tools in the car, and they brought also enough to, if they needed to sleep, and of course they brought their luggage, but if they needed to sleep in the car, they had some pillows and that type of stuff. So it was a large car on purpose. It wasn't just because it was a status symbol. And so one of the things that you'll discover is that people sometimes, and it was large enough for them to sleep in also. People like the noted gospel artist Mahalia Jackson rarely ever slept in a hotel. She said she went from one gig to another driving in her car. She said she didn't even try to find a place to sleep because it wasn't worth the effort. So when she would finish a concert one night and have to go to another, she said she couldn't get a train because they didn't go to some of the places she was going to. So she had this large Cadillac that she would drive in, or her companions would drive while she slept, and they would drive all night to the next location. You had Medgar Evers. He chose a Plymouth Coronet because it was a large car and it was fast. And being a large man himself and being a civil rights worker, when he traveled through Mississippi, he wanted a car that if he had to face a hostile crowd, he could speed away pretty fast. Or if there was no place to sleep, he could sleep comfortably in his car. So there were reasons why they got these cars that were so large, because they wanted to deal with the fact that it wasn't all, even though they could travel, there were also some hindrances or some challenges they would face when traveling. So she writes this book. She set it up from the beginning, and then she brings us into understanding how this car, how the automobile just gives freedom from oppression. And then she begins to talk about how there is this thing called figuring out how to travel safely. It wasn't not enough just to travel, but to travel safely. Because as you travel, being an African American, there were places that you could not go. There were restaurants you could not eat at. There were service stations that you could not go, that would not serve you. Du Bois talks about traveling in one town with a companion, and they saw this service station that said whites only. And they circled the block about 4 or 5 times just to look at this particular service station. And they said the guy had no one there at all. And this man said, what a silly white man. Look at all the money he's losing when he could just take anybody and he would be making money. But you had those issues of where do you go to get gas? Where do you go to use the toilet? Where do you go to get decent food? And so that was an issue that a number of African Americans had to face. She even talks about the pecan. That is not the pecan as in P-E-C-A-N as a nut that you eat, but a can that you urinate in. And they would bring that can or some type of container for a person to urinate while they're traveling or to use the bathroom while they're traveling, because they knew there wouldn't be places for people to go. And so Gretchen Sorin, when she discloses her own traveling, she talks about her father when traveling from Newark to Fayetteville, or even bringing up her grandmother from Fayetteville to Newark, that the grandmother would always insist that they had a pecan, a can to pee in available, always, because there was an issue with traveling. A lot of times when African Americans would travel, according to Gretchen Sorin in her book, she talks about how they would travel, they would start at night so that they wouldn't be seen by cops, and they could travel throughout the night and get to their destination. A lot of them traveled in the middle of the night on purpose so that would not be harassed by various people, by hostile crowds. This wasn't all the time, but at the same time, many of the African Americans that were traveling, they also had to deal with the dangers of being an African American, and that there were people who could be quite hostile to them. Then the other thing that African Americans had to deal with was also the hostility of police officers when they would travel. There were some police officers that were not friendly toward them and that would harass them or would try to make sure that they would haul them in and fine them for a reason. One man stated that if the speed limit say go 50, then you should go, as an African American, you should go 10 miles under speed 40, so that you would not be stopped by a local police officer and given a ticket for speeding over the speed limit. So she sets us up so that she can start talking about the benefit of this book called the Green Book. Now, the Green Book was written by Alfred and Alma, Victor and Alma Green. And it was one of many Negro travel guides. What happened was the African Americans who were traveling, they needed to know of places to stop at that was safe for them to stop at. And so these Green Book or Negro travel guides were created. The Green Book became the most popular one, but there were a number of other guides like the Negro Travel Guide that were created. In fact, the United States Travel Bureau produced a book a pamphlet in 1941 called Negro Hotels and Guest Houses, and it was done through the Department of the Interior in 1941. Because they knew that more and more African Americans were traveling, and therefore they needed safe places to go to in order to enjoy a decent meal, a place to sleep, and even to get refreshed, have some, and get gas. And so the Green Book became the most famous Negro travel guide. And Victor, I think his name was Victor and Alma Green were the authors, and that's why it was called the Green Book. And he along with other Negro travel guide authors, knew that this was a temporary fix, that one day this particular guide would not be needed at all. But at this point, they knew they needed it. And so it became quite popular because it was put in various service stations along the way that were friendly toward African Americans. You guys said, well, what service stations were friendly toward African Americans? According to Gretchen Sorin's book, there's a company called Esso. Does anyone remember the company Esso, E-S-S-O? All right. And that company, from what I gathered, was very friendly toward African Americans. In fact, they recruited numerous African American executives. And they also recruited numerous African Americans to own service stations. And so a lot of times when African Americans traveled, they would look for an Esso station, E-S-S-O. And that station, because they knew, number one, they would probably be able to get gas there without any hassle. Number two, they would probably be able to use the toilet there without any hassle. And number three, they will probably be able to find a Green Book or a Negro travel guide, because that was one of the points of distribution for the Negro travel guide. And so what would happen is these travel guides included places throughout the United States where people could go not only to stop at a hotel, to stop at to get gas, to stop at a restaurant to eat, but it also had places you could go to vacation, such as in New York, such as in Maine, or in Michigan, or in Louisiana. They had all these places that people could, resorts that people could go to, African-American owned resorts that people could go to relax and to enjoy themselves, but also they had places that people could stop at along the way. So if they needed to go to a hotel, they could go to it. Now, have any of you seen the movie, The Green Book? Right. According to Gretchen Sorin, and I agree with her, that particular movie was designed for white people, because in that movie, it shows all the places for African Americans were showed to be subpar, substandard. But when you read her book, she would show you these beautiful hotels that were created by African Americans. And these hotels were places where the top artists would stay, because African American artists in particular, because they could not stay at other hotels. And so numerous, all types of artists. And if you ever look at the film, you have owners of these restaurants. We talk about all the different types of famous people that would come to their restaurant to do all types of activities. Okay, so this Green Book was an excellent tool for African Americans in their travels because it kept them safe as they traveled from place to place. It kept them from having to go into hostile areas such as what they call sundown towns. And those are towns where African Americans were not allowed to be there. They were not allowed to be there after sundown. And there are towns that would proudly say they were the home of the KKK. And so it would prevent them or help them to navigate safely. This book resonates with me so much because as I think about it, I was speaking to my brother-in-law a few weeks ago when I was in North Carolina, and I told him about this book and about the whole issues with transportation for African Americans and that type of stuff. And he told me that he was born in Durham, his parents moved him to Brooklyn, and he ended up in Boston. And he said a lot of times his parents, when they would travel back to Durham, they would not travel on the highways because they didn't see highways as safe, because they said the police would stop them and harass them. And so his father he would have these locations that he would travel to and stop along the way. And that's my brother-in-law, who's probably just a few years older than I am. And so he's talked about how they would stop on different locations of African Americans, and these African Americans would know them because they stopped there so frequently. They would know them for places to eat or places to get gas, and as they traveled. But he said they would never travel on the highway. They would always travel the back roads because they were afraid, because they saw highways as dangerous. Now, she ends up in this book not only talking about the effect of the Green Book, but she also talks about how African American businesses were established because they had all these people visiting them, utilizing their resources, and they had to accommodate these various people. And so there was this thriving African American businesses that were that existed during the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and 50s. As a result of the cars, as a result of the Green Book, they thrived, and they were listed in the Green Book. And so that was one of the beauty of this particular book that she wrote. Sadly, many of the places that are listed in the Green Book, they say only about 13% of those places are still in existence now. Because as people began to travel, you began to get highways. As you got highways went through usually African American areas, because those areas were redlined and they would be devalued regardless of the status. They would devalue that area, and therefore highways went through those particular areas. Resultantly, you found a lot of those businesses were uprooted and destroyed. So as I look at this book, I would just want to conclude with this particular thought, because I think I'm at the end of my time. I want to conclude with this, and that is she talks about the civil rights movement and how it could not be effective without the use of cars. The Montgomery bus boycott, the reason it was successful was because people used their cars to transport people. She talks about even with Martin Luther King, when he flew into an airport, the cities would not allow Black cab drivers to go and pick up anyone at the airports. In fact, and the white cab drivers would not pick up African Americans. And so many times, Martin Luther King and others would go to rent a car, and they would rent a car and drive from the airport to where they need to go. And so she talks about how essential the car was even to the civil rights movement. And so it gives us a whole new way of thinking about cars and the value of cars in African American life. Okay, are there any thoughts or questions?
Well, thank you very much, Reverend Booth. I am sort of interested in this topic because my father, I remember that I actually wrote a little blog post about it, which I actually posted in the comments. My father used to always go to the Esso station long after the Green Book was done, because that the same reason that he liked the Brooklyn Dodgers, because they were that was his, they were his team. I mean, they took care of Black people. I was just remembering that when I was growing up.
Thank you. Thank you. Because when I said Esso, I noticed you shook your head like, yes, yes. You know,
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Great. I also she also talks about the whole issue with people being in car accidents, and how there wasn't a lot of choices for people, African Americans, in car accidents, because at that time hospitals were segregated, and therefore they had a colored section, or they would send you to the colored hospital. And a lot of times the colored hospitals did not have trauma units, which meant that usually a person would die. So any other thoughts on this?
Oh, well, Scott had a question. He said, any thoughts about how Lovecraft Country, a popular TV show, incorporates this topic into the horror science fiction Lovecraft universe?
I don't know anything about Lovecraft, so you guys gotta get me up to speed.
It's not my area of expertise, but Scott can speak to it.
I gotta look it up.
I'm gonna pull. It might be something you might want to check out because it's really interesting. So, H.P. Lovecraft is a really well-known horror writer. He's kind of the father of American horror. He also has a terrible background as a known racist. Amazon did a show called Lovecraft Country, which has a really great cast, and it's primarily people of color are the cast, and it revolves around their lives, which I love because it's kind of like a shot at Lovecraft. But it incorporates like the Green Book and traveling and many other things that you've talked about in this lecture. So I would really suggest to anybody, it's an interesting show to watch. It broke my heart to learn about Lovecraft, the author, because I love the universe that the author created. He was a terrible person, but created a wonderful universe that other people have riffed off of. But a lot of these ideas are incorporated in that fiction, and I love it. So I really suggest just you checking out the first few episodes of the show, because I think, I don't know if you'll enjoy it, but I think you'll enjoy how it's interweaved into that.
I'll try to look at it. It sounds interesting. It sounds interesting. So great, thank you. So this was just a wonderful book. And like I said, I kind of lived, it sounds like, Roger, you've lived this also. So when you read it, kind of a lot of things resonate with you.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really grow up on a segregated train because I didn't really take the train. And I didn't really go and eat at segregated restaurants because my mother called it nasty cafe food. So I don't think my mother went to a restaurant until she was until I was in high school. So I don't recall going to a restaurant at all until I probably was in high school or older at the time, because my mother called it nasty cafe food, and she wouldn't, and I understood why now. She didn't trust it. If they don't want you to eat at their restaurant, then you can't trust them to serve you the food at a takeout. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yes. I was wondering if you thought, or if the author talked about the fact that it seems like when people got cars, specifically when Black people got cars, that the laws changed to make, like, say, loitering in your car more illegal. I mean, to find a way to stop people who are even in their cars driving while Black.
I hadn't thought about that, but I know a number of, she does write how a lot of African Americans, when they were traveling, if they couldn't find a place to stay, they would always kind of like drive off the road so they wouldn't be bothered by anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And so they wouldn't be seen or bothered by anyone. So that's one thing she does say that they would do. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that though.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it sort of started that whole driving while Black phenomenon that, she talks about how, the car is a liberating thing, but it's also has the law or the culture seems to find ways to uh, slow that process down to make
Right.
that less freeing in ways.
The other thing I wanted to bring up was that because a lot of African Americans drove large cars, and now when I think about it, I did grow up, even though I grew up in a working class community, a lot of people have large cars. I never thought about it. I just knew they had a large car. But she said a lot of white people would get upset, white racist people would get upset about the car that an African American was driving. And they felt that they were trying to live beyond above their means and be better than white people. And she said sometimes those cars get damaged by white people just out of spite, because they didn't think a black person should be driving that type of car. And they didn't realize it was out of necessity and not just out of a status symbol. So it doesn't surprise me about anything anymore. So that's kind of sad, but that's what happens. And so they drove them, and she talked about how in the film, it talks about how African Americans would drive home to the South in their cars because they could drive home and see their relatives. And that even people in the South who decided it was time to leave, they would leave the South. They were sharecroppers. They would save enough money and get a car, and they would pack their stuff on their car or truck and drive up north because they've had enough of where they lived. So, but yeah, so I would encourage everyone to read the book or to watch the film. It's a very interesting book, and it resonates very well with what's happening in today's society. And I really think the car industry should give her a medal, an award for writing this interesting and wonderful piece about how cars played a role in liberating African Americans from the dregs of segregation and Jim Crow laws.
Yes, I was thinking about that too, because I mean, one of the things I think I grew up with, it wasn't so much that it was blatant. We didn't go to the South a lot, and we didn't go to the South a lot because, I grew up in Binghamton, so, but even if you got to certain parts of Pennsylvania, you felt like, is this a place you really want to go? And as you get closer to the Mason-Dixon line, it made us very anxious. Oh, by the way, where do you find the video, the film?
It's a national public. No, it's a PBA, public broadcasting.
Okay.
It's public broadcasting.
It's also in the library system. If you Google, don't Google, go to the Upper Hudson Library catalog and type in "Driving While Black," and you get both the book and the movie, and plus a whole bunch of other things.
Thank you for that advertisement for the library, John.
Okay.
Yeah. I actually had a couple of questions. One of them is a lot of the stories that you were recounting were actually from my childhood days or later, but basically at least 50 years ago. Is there any impression that things have changed substantially? I know that in the police stuff, it's hard to know what's going on because the incidents get well advertised, and so you know how horrible they are. But I don't know whether, if you're driving around now, do you worry about whether you'll be able to buy a bite to eat at the local Burger King or and then I had another question after that, which is whether the segregation that was apparent on trains carried over into airplanes, which are now sort of if you don't go by car, you go by airplane usually. So two questions.
Okay. One, things have changed tremendously. In fact, some of those changes affected African American businesses because when there was a push to desegregate businesses, African Americans began to go to those businesses that they weren't able to go to, but whites did not reciprocate and go to Black businesses. And so a number of those businesses started declining because they didn't have the personnel or the patrons. So there has been a lot of changes that have been made where most African Americans feel comfortable going to a restaurant or whatever without any issues. Now, I will say this though, in traveling in rural areas, um, uh, a lot of times I know African Americans try to keep their wits about them even now because you just don't know what you're going to encounter. So in certain rural areas, I know um, that sometimes if you're driving through some type of little rural town and sometimes you look at the service station to see, is that a service station I really want to stop at? Or is this one of those good old boy service stations I want to bypass? I mean, sometimes you do have that in the back of your mind, but overall things have changed for the better. With planes, there was an issue with planes in terms of planes were segregated, and that has changed tremendously. I don't know about it might be I don't know about how, but I know that's changed tremendously over time. Hospitals. I was just reading an article about Medicare during the Johnson administration and how Medicare forced hospitals to quietly integrate, and because they had a rule in it that they would lose their funding. And so Johnson had an army of civil rights workers and other people who would go to hospitals when Medicare was implemented to make sure that these hospitals were taking in all types of people, because he was going to make sure that if they didn't, they would lose their funding. So that's why even hospitals became very integrated very quietly because of Medicare. Isn't it amazing? I just read that article recently. So there are a lot of things that have happened in a positive way, but at the same time, we do have issues with housing, with even people who look at a house that an African American live in, and they would devalue it lower than than a white person. This one woman on Twitter, she talks about how she had her house appraised twice, 3 times. The first 2 times it was appraised at 100,000. Second time 125,000, and she thought, no, I've made more than enough improvements. So she had to get a friend, a white male friend, to pretend that he was her sister. She had to email an appraiser without letting the person know what her color was, take everything out of the house that even indicated there was a person of color that lived there. And then when the appraiser came, she had her white brother to go to the house and say, oh, my sister couldn't make it because she's out of town, and so she told me to come. They valued her house at $270,000. A big difference from 125,000. Big difference. Yep. And that's what happens. And even they've seen it with even African Americans who are very famous, that they've had their houses devalued because of their color. In fact, one famous person, he had his house was so devalued that he said he could not believe it, and so they had it reevaluated, and the evaluation was so much higher. So they asked the first person, "Why did you devalue it the way?" He said, "Because I could." So those are things that are happening too. They're subtle, but those are things that happen, and they're robbing African Americans of their wealth. So it's kind of a mixed bag. We still have a lot of white supremacists in our country, as we've seen because of Donald Trump. He's let the roaches come out in the sunshine. And so you do have a lot of white supremacists and neo-Nazis and those type people that have come out. So, but we do have a lot of allies too, as we always had throughout the centuries. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's as good as I can do.
Well, it's excellent from my point of view. I have another question, actually. Do you know a book called South of Haunted Dreams?
South of Haunted Dreams? No, I don't.
By Eddie Harris.
No, I don't.
Eddie Harris he's an African American who went to Stanford. So, you know, he's pretty smart. Anyway, one of the stories that I remember from South of Haunted Dreams was, but before I get to that, let me fill in a little bit about the book. Harris decided that he was going to get a big motorcycle and ride around in the South just to see what things were like. So he's roaring along and gets low in gas, so he pulls into this little one-pump station, you know, general store kind of place, and starts filling up the gas tank at the pump, and a guy and a white guy in a pickup truck comes in and sees him and just leans on the horn, "Get out of the way, fella." And so Eddie says that he just all of a sudden couldn't move fast, so he was as if everything was frozen, and he did it as slowly as he could. And then when the guy got out of the truck, he was sort of angry, and so Harris said to him, "You want to fight?" The guy said, "You bet I do. I'm going to beat you up." And so Harris responded to say, "Well, since you're challenging me, I get to choose the weapons, and I think I'll choose wits. We'll have a battle of the wits." And then he looked at him and he said, "But I can't fight an unarmed man." And he got on his motorcycle and drove off.
Good joke.
Yeah. So at
Thank
the end
you.
of the book, Harris was stopping in at a place, and I guess the woman at the little restaurant, when she heard him talking and so on, said, "Things really have changed. You need to wake up to it." So I found it a fascinating book. It's actually probably 20 or 30 years old now.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions?
Only one. It's more a thought than a question. When I was watching one of the Tulsa stories this past, June, one of the things that I did not know is that after the initial assault on Tulsa, they tried to build Tulsa back up. And what really killed Black Tulsa was the stuff about the roads you talked about. I was like, it wasn't, the first thing was terrible and awful, and we all now know more about that. But it was the second assault of the roads cutting through the black part of town, which totally let Black Tulsa die.
And that is a common occurrence throughout the United States. Whereas the highway systems targeted African-American neighborhoods and communities. In my own hometown, a large African-American business community called Hayti, Hayty, lost over 500 businesses, and numerous residents were relocated. My own neighborhood in Durham, North Carolina was targeted. We stopped it because of a lawsuit with the federal court decided to have an injunction against that particular highway because they said it was violating our rights because it had targeted African-American communities. And we were the last African-American community that it was targeting. So it had to negotiate with the community. And so what happened was the community was relocated intact as a group down the road a piece so this highway could go through. But it is a common occurrence throughout this nation, whereas most of these highways have gone through African-American communities and they have uprooted them because they did not see them as value. They redlined them and they saw them mostly as slums or low-income places, and they did not look at the total package to see the value of what was going on in that community. And that happens so much, and it has ruined numerous business people from their livelihoods. So thank you, Roger. How true. And Tulsa is just one of many communities that you'll find. And most of those communities that were enlisted, those businesses that were listed in the Green Book were uprooted because of a highway system and urban renewal.
True enough. Well, unless somebody else has a question, I think we've come to the end of our time. I really appreciate your insight and your wisdom and your sharing, and know that this is going to be on a recording so that other people will be able to see this in a couple weeks.
Okay, I want to thank you for the opportunity of doing this. Thank you, Albany Public Library. I wish you all well. Have a great day. And remember, when you're dealing with racism, remember it is not a sprint, but it's a triathlon. and we will have many challenges, but we will overcome those challenges. Have a good day.
You too.
Thank you
Okay.
very much.
Thank you.